Welcome, everybody, to the Photovoice podcast, People, Power, and Photovoice. The title of this podcast today is called There Be Monsters, Balancing Power and Photovoice. We are really excited to have you here for the Journal of Health Promotion Practice special series of podcasts on people, power, and Photovoice, and the little method that could change the world, as my co-editor Bob says. My name's Robin Evans-Agnew. I'm a co-editor of this special issue, coming up totally focused on Photovoice in January 2022. For those of you new to Photovoice, it's a participatory visual method where participants take and discuss photos on health promotion issues relevant to their lives and then act to change them through raising awareness, mitigation of the problems, or transformation of the policies that oppress. In advance of publication, we wanted you to meet some of the folks behind the special issue with a brief opportunity to chat about their experiences with the method, the people they work with, their thoughts about the roots and the frontiers of application for this method in the world of health promotion. So now it's time for you to meet my amazing co-editor, the inimitable Bob Strack, who will be introducing our guests. And I think you've got a little line that you wanted to kind of read and intro people with as well, right, Bob?
I do. I mean, I'm like you. I'm excited. These discussions become so interesting because we have so many interesting people doing interesting work. And today we're joined by Jody Early, who's on faculty at the University of Washington, Bothell, and we're with Victoria Sanchez, who's at the University of New Mexico. I was going to introduce them separately, but their interests and overlaps are so similar that I can honestly just talk about both of them relative to their involvement with vulnerable populations, their engagement with free area. You're like us, you're sort of come out of the free area in school, and your just belief that power is within the people that we work with. So looking at your record, your CBPR, your use of Photovoice is perfect for what we want to talk about today. So I'm real excited. And I know we've talked about some questions, but to get us kind of going, I wanted to revisit, because we're talking about power, right? And we're talking about how Photovoice resides within that. And, you know, when I think about power, I go back to Carolyn Wong and Marianne Burris's original piece where they talked about how it's useful to think about power to, power with, and power over as three different kinds of the processes. That each has its own distinct reality, but they're also distinct, right? They go on to talk about power to as an affirming power, or the ability to accomplish things. Power with is the ability to work other people towards a common purpose. And power over is the ability to influence or direct people or the physical and natural environment. You know, and that sort of framing that they gave to us from the original piece to today still is a part and parcel of the method. And so we just kind of want to get things going and kind of ask about why and what is important in terms of talking about power within Photovoice. What's your view? How have you come down on this? Go ahead, Jody.
Our guests are stunned. They don't know what to say. Jody,
know,
why don't you go first?
This is the power with, where we share the power with you.
You know, I've been thinking a lot about this. First, I was reading Foucault lately, and I think about what
always a bedtime story, right? With
right,
Foucault,
you know,
isn't it?
A little bit,
exactly.
Light reading. Yeah. But about he talks about how it's a constant flux of negotiation. And so when we talk about often the phrase balancing power, I think it's more about shifting and that negotiation. And so part of what I think Victoria and I have talked about outside of this podcast is how does this happen all along the way? It's not just at one point, right? It happens all along the way. The other thing I've been thinking a lot about is this use of power, and especially the term empowerment, and how it comes up so much in our writings about Photovoice. But I think Wang and Burris talked about the fact that in order to be empowered, or when we talk about empowerment, people have to have access to knowledge, access to decision-making, access to resources, and access to networks. So I think that's also something that might frame this conversation today as we're talking about power to, right? Or power with. All of those, you know, how do those four things play into this methodology and our outcomes, our hopeful outcomes? Victoria, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, as I was thinking about this, and of course, we've been influenced by many people in the field, I came across a thing by Carolyn Wang that said, and I think this has to do with power. I mean, I think that this is about how we enter the process as learners, not as experts. We can be guiders. I think that in terms of power, it goes along each of the phases in a Photovoice project. I think power starts with who asks the questions, what communities we engage with. Bob, I was reading one of your pieces when you were working with youth, and I'm thinking, a youth community and working within that focus of power is very different than maybe working with other communities, just from who youth are in a social dimension and who they are in the social dimensions. I'm thinking about power as this idea of collective empowerment, which is much more, I think, consistent with the outcomes of Photovoice than maybe thinking just about individual empowerment. And so when we think about power, we're looking in Photovoice at power to achieve a social action or to achieve social change. And I think that goes back to resources and a lot of other things. I'm going to stop there.
You say social action. I love that idea, right? It's a social thing. Mm-hmm. It's like what Jody was talking about, sort of like in the constant flux of negotiation, right? So the social action, people talk about it, right? Back and forth. Through dialogue comes that sharing of power, or through dialogue comes that constant flux, right, of negotiating power over voice. That's kind of what you were talking about in terms of collective action? Yeah.
Yeah, I think Photovoice is always about any kind of participatory action research, and Photovoice, I think, falls into that. Really is about negotiating power from the outset. So it's negotiating with, how do we choose communities? How do we work with communities? Who gets to the table? There's also power within the communities that we're working with. Not everybody has an equal voice, even, and I think it would be naive for us to think that everybody at the table has an equal voice or equal power. And I've seen this play out in much of my research where there is not equity within even a group. And so I think Photovoice has the potential to really equalize that power, because when people are able to answer the questions in ways that are meaningful to them through the photographs they take, they are able then to think about and socially construct what this means individually and then as a collective. I think it actually does shift, and it has the potential to shift power imbalances within a partnership, or within a partnership between the community and an academic, or even within community members themselves. I've seen that happen not in very specific ways and more nuanced ways. But I do think that we think about often power between the researcher and the community, but I don't want to miss the power imbalances that exist within community. And then our role, perhaps as facilitators, to help bring that imbalance to a more balanced perspective through some of the Photovoice methodologies that we can use, and the critical consciousness questioning that we can bring to the communities. Does that make sense to you all?
Yeah, so it's sort of like an awareness when you go in, because I am thinking about the community organizations. I remember my first project, I was in the schools, in Seattle schools, and I was meeting with kids in a health office inside a health room in a high school. And I had a very grumpy nurse. And I'm a school nurse, so I like school nurses, but this one was a very grumpy nurse. And she was very upset that we were sort of going over time. There's just a lot of things that there were negotiations kind of going on about my right to be there with the youth that this nurse was, taking care of. And it was just it was very interesting in terms of, I ended up having to sort of protect the space, right, for the meeting, right? I had to sort of set some boundaries and navigate that. And that's sort of like, that's facilitating sort of beyond just the power that comes with the kids and the voices and the photos. It's this other sort of layer that comes in with working inside community organizations. How about you, Jody? How does it?
I was thinking I was thinking what you were talking about, Victoria, and just, I'd love to read more in the work that's published about Photovoice, about the reflexivity in the process. Like, how do people go about that process within them, like thinking within themselves as the researcher? And I think about this theory of intersectionality and how that impacts this whole collaboration together. There's that reflexivity with the researcher thinking about the positionality, or maybe it doesn't happen enough, but how we don't see that a lot in our journals, and how it would be nice to see more of that. But also in sort of priming or preparing to engage in this together collaboratively, a dialogue around what are we all bringing to this. And to what you were saying, Victoria, you know, in many of the projects that I've been involved with, having the spirit of, we may share, you know, a particular heritage, but, you know, I do not live my life as a undocumented individual. This was a recent project I was asked to be a part of, and understanding that, you know, I'm there to learn and I'm there to listen. But there are these tensions that happen even within the process itself. But I think the point I wanted to make is, you know, how much of that reflexivity are we having before we, you know, how much of that in our preparation do we do?
Are you talking about, I'm curious, are you talking about reflexivity on the part of the researcher, project leader, or on the part of the participants?
I'm actually talking about both. So, you know, going into this as a researcher, as a guide, doing that yourself, but then also, is there an opportunity to even talk about that within the group that you're working with? So, Victoria, to your point, you know, there's all of these other, and I think it was Supla that talks about this, what's not being talked about in part of this process? Like, what are these other power struggles and dynamics that are happening within Photovoice that we're not talking about in the research itself?
I think that's exactly right. You know, I think, you know, Victoria, when you were talking, it struck me, when we think about power, we're always talking about it relative to authoritative power, right? And that's typically where people's brains go, like who's got the authority to make a decision, who's got the resources to dole out money. But if you look at French and Raven, and you mentioned Foucault, you look at French and Raven, and they have informational power and reverent power. Those have nothing to do with, you know, purse strings. It has everything to do with knowledge. And you think about, I don't know if you've had this experience doing Photovoice projects, but often, you know, you go before an IRB and you kind of say, this is what we're working on. And they're saying, well, what topic are you working on? And what's your solution? I said, no, I always say, I don't know. It's up to my participants. It's up to my collaborators. It's up to my research partners who are my photographers who are going to determine what the issue is. And so I don't claim that power out of the gate, right? And so in that case, there's a deference to that informational power, that genuine experience that you're inviting and asking people to be co-researchers with you. And it's often, I don't know, do you have the experience where you have to kind of explain that to your colleague researchers who don't do this kind of participatory work?
Yeah, of course. But yeah, I think this is also an opportunity for us to work with our colleagues to really guide them and inform them about new ways of knowing. I think that the value in Photovoice, that it really is knowledge production it can be in the best sense of the word, and democracy of knowledge. And I think if we think about, you know, what research is, it's unveiling and uncovering new ways of knowing and new knowledge. So I think that we could actually use Photovoice and other participatory approaches with our IRBs to try to get them to expand and to think outside the box. I think a number of people are doing this in the country, getting community IRBs going who really listen to what's happening in community. But to somebody else's point, I think for me, the whole, much of the Photovoice process boils down to that idea of whether you're a researcher or community, or whether you're facilitating that, is kind of that, you know, that Freudian triad of listening, dialogue, and action, you know, and then that iteration that comes from each of those stages. And I think that happens at every stage of the research, from the inception through even changing. Participants may not stay, participants may come and go. So I think there's just this beautiful iterative process that happens in Photovoice where we can see power changing and shifting, and we can actually facilitate that both with our colleagues and within the communities that we work. I got a little off topic there.
Okay, yeah, but I want to follow up on that because you've been really engaged, Victoria, a long time on sort of CBPR designs and thinking around how CBPR acts and works in communities. So Photovoice has been plunking along, you know, gathering interested people for here and there, and then now we're doing a special issue. But what learnings from CBPR could be really imputed or introduced inside the way Photovoice is currently sort of conceived or enacted, right? I'm thinking about Jody's point about Could the participant reflexivity be a more important part? Is that something that CBPR designs are trying to advance and have people in groups encounter the power dynamics that are working within them in different ways? What sort of things could CBPR teach Photovoice right now at this juncture?
That's the $60,000 question. Jody, let me think about it for a minute. Go ahead.
Jody's got one.
So we, as Victoria and I have been talking about this, I wrote down a list of questions that I think would be great to infuse into planning in this type of way. But I think the big soundbite is, I'm always thinking about, are we just replicating existing systems? Like, is this colonizing methodology saying that it's not, but is it? And it happens from everything to like, what's the reciprocity? What's the, and it goes back to what Victoria was saying, like, what are we really trying to achieve, and who's the impetus, and who's bringing this question, and what are the ultimate goals? Who's at the table? If we think about, again, going back to power, who needs to be at the table, right? So in terms of networks and really creating that policy change, that is the triad, right? That piece, the policy change and action, who do we need to also be connected with? Photovoice could be at times, it could be, handing people cameras or their phones, using their phones and showing what they perceive to be lived realities. But the ultimate is, how are we really creating that social change? And thinking about so whose voices are being heard, whose are not? Do images that are chosen, like who's choosing those? Are they reinforcing, stereotypes? What's the unintended consequences? What are potential unintended consequences? And what's meaningful dissemination? That there, in terms of CBPR, I think we talk a lot about that. So what is that meaningful dissemination with Photovoice? It may not be. I was in a project where exhibit was not an option, with working with undocumented students, not in the way that you would typically see this written about. They did not want to be physically there at an exhibit. They wanted to record narratives to go along with this. So, that again goes back to that negotiation of power and
having that kind of top level sort of understanding of whether we're recreating institutions of oppression in our work, right? Fascinating stuff.
Also, yeah, you raise a point, Jody, and Robin asked about CBPR. We're talking about power within that framework, right? And so the thing that strikes me is our definition of community. It's sort of that prickly topic that always comes up about where do you define the boundaries of community? So, in Baltimore, we did projects with, you were mentioning the article earlier, Victoria, with young people, right? Was our community just Highlandtown, Canton? Or was the community inclusive of the researchers and the civic leaders that we were pulling in? And where you draw those boundaries creates an opportunity to examine where the power needs to come into play. It's unrealistic to have a young person be connected to the mayor, but it might not be unrealistic for the researcher to have a connection where you can be a linker, a connector between those two voices in the community. And so how we use CBPR to define the boundaries of community and people's ethical roles to use their power within that framework, I think is kind of what Robin was getting at. And I think it's exciting to see the work that you guys are doing to kind of ask those questions.
When you were talking about that, I was thinking about one of the core principles of Barbara Israel's CBPR and other folks. And, it comes from Guy Stewart, communities of identity, communities of practice, and communities of solution. And I think that in terms of Photovoice, I think it kind of was, when you were talking about that experience, Bob, I think it really refers back to that. It's who's at the table, and who's identifying with this topic. But then the communities of solution may have to be other stakeholders and people that have different kinds of power, the policymakers. Wang would argue that you need policymakers there from the beginning. I actually don't know if I totally agree with that because of the power differentials if you're working with students and policymakers. But I think of communities of identity, practice, and solution as one way to think about how to organize and frame who's at the table at what junctures and in what phases of a Photovoice project.
Lots to talk about, isn't it?
That is lovely. Oh my gosh. Fantastic. Bob, you're right. We're probably out of time, but guys, check these podcasts back. We got a surprise podcast coming up in this. Victoria's hooked us up with someone amazing. You're going to want to hear this as well. So this wraps up our short segment. Well done, everybody. I'm so super enthused about this idea of connecting more deeply to the CBPR roots of Photovoice in engaging with and learning about how to manage power and negotiate the flux. Thanks so much, Jody, and thanks so much, Victoria, for being here.